Hello! Today we're going to talk about the great Diego Rodríguez de Silva y Velázquez, most commonly known just as Velázquez. This is a quote apparently that Velázquez said himself, which says, "I would rather be the first painter of common things than second in high art." Which basically means that he wanted to move away from the general trends and that he didn't want to do what everybody was doing, and he would rather focus on less important things, apparently. He would later in his life, he would become the court painter, and he was responsible for documenting his time. However, much time later, Picasso recognized that the artist's primary concern, for example, was not to simply create a replica of what he saw, but more to communicate information about what he saw in his own very particular way. Let's learn a little bit about his life very briefly. So he was born in Sevilla in 1599. He died in 1660, which is not too bad for the time. He studied with Pacheco, a very well-known master from Sevilla, since the age of 11, and sometime later he would marry Pacheco's daughter. He got the title of master at the age of 18, and with the help of his father-in-law, he managed to get into the social, aristocratic, and intellectual circle and in contact with the crown. His first works were inspired by Tenebrism. You'll know now what that means. And his production is not incredibly big. He may have produced around 110, 120 different paintings. It's not too much for the quality of the artist. And again, moving away from the general trend of the time, he has very few religious works. For example, this Adoration of the Magi or the Christ Crucified that we can see here. We are going to see the second more in detail later on. And some of the most important features of Velázquez's painting is, first, his naturalism, in the sense that it's basically as if you were looking at a photograph more than a painting. He was an excellent portraitist. He was even criticized for that because they said that that was the only thing he could do. He was also the master of aerial perspective. We will learn later on what that means with the work Las Meninas and some other works that he created. His main concern throughout his whole career and life was the use of light. How to work with light to create the effect that he really wanted, and also to capture the psychological personality of the people that he was portraying. He could do all that because he had the creative liberty that gave him to work for the king. Also, one very interesting feature about Velázquez is that he painted a la prima. A la prima means with no previous sketch, which is amazing considering the type of painting composition that he had. Okay, so his life as an artist can be divided into different stages. The first one would be the first one, in Sevilla, more like learning type of stage, and then the second stage is considered when he moved to Madrid. Then there is like an intermission with his first trip to Italy. And after the first trip to Italy, he had the new stage, considered the new stage, the first stage, again in Madrid, another in-between phase, another learning phase, with a second trip to Italy, and his final and most important stage, the fourth stage, again back to Madrid. Okay, so let's have a look to what he did in each of these stages. The first one, again, would be in Sevilla, where he started creating genre paintings. Genre paintings are depiction of everyday common themes, and he used earthly type of tonalities like ochres, browns, oranges, like for example in the Old Woman Frying Eggs that we are going to see in a second. And he also started inspired by the tenebrism used by Caravaggio and Caravaggio's art in general. This painting, Old Woman Frying Eggs, you can see all the detail, all the textures, how we can differentiate the metal, the ceramic, even the frying oil. Another one from this time period, the Water Cellar of Seville, which apparently is an allegory for the three ages of man. You can see 1, 2, 3 men in the painting. And then the influence of Caravaggio. The painting on the left is Caravaggio's, and the painting on the right is Velázquez's. So the similarities are quite obvious in this painting. And once he got into contact with the crown with the help of his father-in-law, his success was immediate. And he became one of the king's painters, and the king would be his only client from then on. Okay, so he created quite a few paintings of Philip IV during this stage, the king's family, and also the Count Duke of Olivares. Who is this Count Duke? It's basically the leader of the country, the one that was actually leading the country, because Philip was more into hunting and painting and listening to music rather than reigning in his own kingdom. From this time period, we also have quite a few, one of the mythological themes that he created that we have seen a detail before, which is the triumph of Bacchus. To gain or to open his way into court, he used this painting of the very famous poet Luis de Góngora, and he captured the personality of the poet so well in this painting that the king was amazed, and that was what captured his attention towards the painter too. About his mythological painting, this Triumph of Bacchus, or the Feast of Bacchus, or the Drunkards, shows this theme very well known in Spanish literature called picaresque, where several rows seem to be gathering around the god of wine and pleasure called Bacchus. Bacchus is described as almost nude, which is not too common, as you know, in Baroque time period in Spain, and calls our attention the red and white robe. You can see it better in this bigger image. It is also fascinating how he captured the essence of these people that seem to be drunk, how they look like almost laughing, and being tipsy, and having a great time. Of the collection of King Philip IV, we have, for example, this portrait that shows King Philip in a very formal attire. Then Rubens, a very famous Dutch painter, came to Spain, to Madrid, because the king wanted him to create a painting for himself. So he convinced Velázquez that he had to go to Italy. After some discussion with the king, he goes to Italy on a study trip with the king's permission. That's the moment when he leaves tenebrism behind, and he's now more worried about color and perspective, and how space also becomes more important as well, the occupation of space. If you remember, that was one of the main concerns and influences that El Greco had achieved from Michelangelo. Also, he adapted the excellent anatomical study that Michelangelo was so good at. All of that is reflected in this painting called The Forge of Vulcan. You have an activity you can work on for this magnificent painting. This painting is based in the story where Apollo on the left and Vulcan on the right have this conversation about something. I don't want to give you any spoilers. When he comes back to Italy is when the maturity cycle starts, and he becomes the official big portrait of the Spanish crown. From this time period, we have again equestrian portraits, different members of the family, and this really long series of paintings of Prince Philip IV, or King by now, Philip IV. It is quite a good thing because that way we have been able to see the evolution of this king in our history. So, for example, if we compare the first painting from the first stage of the first time, that he was in Madrid, second stage, and the fourth stage, again in Madrid, we can see that the difference of the king, his hair, even his mustache, everything changed because obviously time had passed. There was also one point where the king refused to have his portrait created by Velázquez because he was so good at it that the king could see himself reflected on it, and he could see himself aging in those paintings. So he refused to have any more paintings done by Velázquez. Apart from the king, he also created several portraits of different random people that he would treat with the same precision and respect as he would do with the king's painting. For example, this Niño de Vallecas or this Pablillo de Valladolid, who was a buffoon. He's dressed up in black and just a plain background, which is slightly lighter than the robe he's wearing. This is a new technique that was introduced by Velázquez, and it's the technique called neutral space, which is basically space with no references. The only way we can distinguish the floor is because of the shadow, but there is no other reference of space in the painting. Another gesture here that served Prince Baltasar Carlos, and a couple more. Okay. From this time period, we also have this astonishing representation of Christ crucified. This is also one of my favorite paintings by Velázquez because even though it's religious, which seems to go with the general trend, he does his own personal interpretation. Like, look at that face. It's incredible. It's so modern, so you can almost see through his eyes and they are closed. And if we see the painting against a black background, we focus our attention immediately in the body of Jesus Christ, which for me it's just amazing. Apart from that, we have this guy. I don't know if you recognize him, but if you don't know who he is, you might not say that it's Mars. And it's this very atypical representation of Mars, who is supposed to be the god of war, but he doesn't look strong or he's not fighting. We can see like old type of skin, remember, like Jose de Rivera. And he seems to be like bored with everything, giving up, not that strong anymore. And maybe this self-portrait that he might have created, but it hasn't been confirmed 100%. Well, from this time period, he also has a very important painting about a war theme, which basically represent the transfer of the keys to the city from the Dutch to the Spanish army during the siege of the city of Breda, which is in the Netherlands. Basically, it's the representation of war between Protestants and Catholics, and obviously Catholic ones, because otherwise he wouldn't have had this painting done. And it was a request of the Count Duke of Olivares, who is actually in the painting, looking at us next to the horse. Okay, you can have a look at it in this bigger image. And you have also another activity to work on this painting. After this session of different paintings where his style evolves every day, basically, he has to go back to Italy, this time because the king has some important affairs to do and he trusts the painter to be in charge of those affairs. So from this time period, we have several famous works like the portrait of the Pope, Innocent X, Venus and Cupid, and the Medici's Vela. Let's start with the Pope. To gain the interest of the Pope, he used this painting of his servant, and it was the servant himself that took the painting to the Pope. So when the Pope saw the painter and the person being painted, he could see how good Velázquez was and allowed Velázquez to have him painted. That was a very unusual thing to happen because only Italian painters were allowed to paint the Pope back at the time. This man was known as a cruel, suspicious, irritable, impatient, and he was 73 years old at the time. I don't know, probably you will, but I don't know if you see all those features represented in this painting. Well, the Pope did see him represented in the painting, and his reaction was troppo vero, which in Italian means too accurate. Like, thank you for taking this picture of me where I look cruel, suspicious, irritable, impatient, and so on. Okay? In the painting, you can see that the Pope is holding a paper. That's the space that Velázquez used to sign, and he leaves testimony of the event in the tiny piece of paper used by the Pope. It was not his idea to paint him like that. Other painters like Raffaello and Pietro da Cortona had already painted popes using that type of combination, but it's Velázquez's painting that differentiates from these other paintings in the way that he captured the personality of the Pope. Look at that look. Look at that mouth, so tight, so tense. So when you look at it, it's like, ooh, I'm scared of that man. This painting is so unique that quite a few centuries later, Sir Francis Bacon decided to create a couple of versions of his own. You have a video showing one of them in the website. And also again, from this time period, we have the Venus and Cupid. What's different about this painting that was not so common back then? Yes, nudity. And the introduction of one technique that he will use later in his painting, the mirror technique, which is how he connects the audience through one of the characters reflected on a mirror. And finally, about this trip to Italy, he decided to recreate this villa. And it's a completely modern version of a landscape. It's incredible how modern this is. And it has been compared to paintings that were done more than 2 centuries after he created this one. Well, so after his trip to Italy, he decided he was requested by the king to go back to court, and it's when his final stage starts, and it's when he creates his culminating masterpieces. This second trip to Italy marks a turning point in his life, and he intensifies after that his achievements, his manners, his style. Everything is improved. He was already great, but now he was even greater. And from this time period, we have, of course, royal portraits that we will talk about in a minute. Another one, mythological theme. And of course, his best-known painting, Las Meninas. About the royal portraits, he had to create these many paintings of the Infanta Margarita, the center of the painting Las Meninas, because she was supposed to get married to somebody living in Austria, and the only way they had for the fiancé to see the evolution of the girl was to send him paintings. So we can see a little Infanta, then the Infanta growing up, then she becomes older, and basically it's like sending pictures through Instagram today. Okay? Yeah. What about this event? Why is it important? This is Queen Mariana and the Emperor Leopold, who were sister and brother. They look quite alike because they are sister and brother. But this is Emperor Leopold and King Charles II, who at the same time is our uncle and nephew, but also brothers-in-law. They also look quite alike, but the second one look a bit more damaged. Why did they become brothers-in-law? Because Margarita had to marry her uncle Leopold at the age of 14, and he was over 40 at the time. Yes, I know, gross. Well, together with Infanta Margarita, he created different paintings of, for example, Infanta Maria Teresa, the sister of Queen Marianne of Austria. And again, you can see they almost look as if they were the same person. And it's basically what ended with the dynasty, because they had been marrying between themselves since the Catholic monarchs. From this time period, we also have a more mythological painting, like this personal vision of this mythological passage between Mercury or Hermes, who has been sent by Zeus to kill Argus. And this representation, again, is almost impressionist because of the loose brushstrokes, the homogeneous use of light. And again, one more mythological theme where he used like a very fluid type of painting, no lines at all, everything is blended in. He captures and plays with light, and it's become one of his most intriguing paintings. You have it bigger, more in detail here, and you can also work on it on an activity. Finally, his masterpiece, Las Meninas, where the painter depicts himself posing in the act of painting, demonstrating that his craft requires action and reflection, because he was trying to maintain the idea that painting And the artist was not the artisan. Artist had to be considered something else, something above just reproducing things. But we will talk about this painting more in detail when we get there. So far, we are done with this section. Thank you, everyone.